From Mount Misery to Mount Hope, is there a possibility that this country can represent something other than torture to the rest of the world? That is the question. The issue of torture is one that Glenn takes on a regular basis in his writing and his blogging. It is such a critical issue of our time. When President Obama came into office, it was one of his first acts to issue an executive order to outlaw torture, to close Guantanamo within a year. He has not done the same for extraordinary rendition, which is simply White House for kidnapping. Thousands of people have been kidnapped. Yes, not dozens, not hundreds, thousands. A sheikh off the streets of Milan, Maher Arar, the Canadian citizen going through JFK Airport, coming back from a family vacation, not planning to get off in New York, just going through to go home to Canada, taken off out of the airport, taken into custody, then sent off to Syria, where he was born, but had fled with his family, hadn't served in the military there, knew that he would be tortured if he was sent there, begged the US authorities not to send him to Syria, which they did in one of those private jets. He wept all the way there, and sure enough, he was put in a grave-like cell. He was held for 10 months and 10 days. He was tortured, he was interrogated, and as inexplicably as he was taken, he was released, a broken man, to Canada. Canadian Judicial Commission did a big investigation, exonerated him fully. The Bush ally Prime Minister, Stephen Harper, held a news conference. Maher Arar was awarded $10 million, and Harper, President Bush's ally, castigated the Bush administration, demanding to know why there wasn't an apology for Maher Arar, why he's still on a terrorist watch list in this country. How is it possible that this is what we represent? How is it possible that this is for national security? Because when you think about it, if an American citizen, if an American official, if an American government official is captured somewhere, what happens when his captors say, "I'll do it the American way"? No, this is not good for us. It's not good for our national security. And these are the kind of issues that have to be regularly exposed in the media, because when Americans find out, they do care. It does matter. Which brings us to why kids are really the hope, and they can see beyond all of this. You know, in the time that President Bush was finally forced to admit that they didn't have weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, that exposed more than him. You know, if he had a little megaphone on the steps of the White House and intoned WMD, maybe some people would have believed him. But it exposed the entire US press corps, because it was the press corps, it was the newspapers, the radio, and the television that convinced Americans. This is the problem when you have a media that acts as a conveyor belt for the lies of the administration. The lies take lives. That's why it matters. And when people saw that it wasn't true, they looked elsewhere. And that's where I think independent media has grown in such a big way over these years, because people lost faith in the traditional ways they were getting information. I think it's also part of why Democracy Now! Has grown so enormously in these 13 years, from starting in 1996 on a few dozen community radio stations, now on close to 800 radio, television, public access TV, PBS stations, increasingly on NPR stations, on Pacifica stations. And at this time, I want to thank, as Jeff did, Friends of Democracy Now!, which tapes the program off the satellite and shows them on Pegasus Cable 13 here, 8 noon and 11:30. By the way, it costs them something like $25 a month, so if people want to help, I know they're out in the lobby. And also want to thank Ithaca Community Radio, FM 88.1, broadcasting Democracy Now! 9 to 10, Monday through Friday. Thank you so much for being there for Democracy Now! We have to protect all these independent media outlets. It's so interesting as newspapers die around the country. Rocky Mountain News was just about to celebrate 150 years, survived the Depression, floods, but could not survive through this year. Just came from Seattle 2 days ago. The Seattle Post-Intelligencer has died as a newspaper, a tiny staff that's working on the website. And we're seeing this all over this country. The Philadelphia newspapers, the Daily News, the Philadelphia Inquirer, bankrupt. The Minneapolis Star-Tribune, bankrupt. The Tucson Citizen is closed. I mean, all over this country. And they are all now looking at the model that Pacifica pioneered, the idea of nonprofit media and how important it is. We have to protect our community media outlets, and public access TV is very much under threat. You know how public access was born? It was media activists, independent media activists who understood the power of television and also the power of monopoly. When a cable company comes into town, whether it's Cablevision or Comcast or Time Warner, what do you have here? Time Warner, we have that in New York. One company gets the monopoly because they only want one company to dig up the roads to lay the cable. And in exchange, media activists wrested some public channels, places where you can make your own media. Now with the telecoms entering into delivery of television, they're not offering public interest channels, and now the cable companies that were basically really clobbered into providing those channels are saying this is unfair competition. We shouldn't have to do it because the telecoms aren't having to do it. And we cannot allow public access to die. We have to ensure that the regulation is there, not only for public access TV and for community radio, but also to ensure that the internet remains open and free. We have to ensure network neutrality. But speaking of torture, the voices of the young are so important. A story we did on Democracy Now! A while ago. It was the story of some presidential scholars. You know, there's this program in this country that, well, the best students in each school, I don't know how that's determined, but 3 students from every state are sent to Washington, D.C. in their senior year to meet the President of the United States. It's called the Presidential Scholar Program. And this happened a few years ago under the Bush administration. And we interviewed 2 of these young scholars. You know, this was their big moment. They were going to meet the President, happened to be then George W. Bush at the time. And they went to Washington, D.C. They were going to meet him in the Rose Garden. We interviewed Marioi and Leah Anthony Librescu. Mari is from Wellesley. She went to Wellesley High. Leah Anthony Librescu went to a high school in Long Island, Hewlett High School. And the night before Mari was to meet with the President, with her other presidential scholars, she thought, oh, this is an unbelievable moment. You know, this is something people want to do all over the country, to say something to the President, and I have this opportunity. So she sat down, organized the other scholars to sit down, and said, why don't we write him a letter? And they worked all through the night. And they hand wrote this letter, and 1/3 of the presidential scholars signed it, about 50 of them. Leah Anthony Librescu was a little concerned about the letter. She thought, what if they confiscate it from Mari? And so she made a copy of it herself, and they signed that letter too. And Mari put it in her pocket, and, well, Leah put it up her sleeve. And they went to the Rose Garden, and they met President George W. Bush. And he said to them, the decisions you make today will determine the rest of your lives. And so Mari saw this as her opportunity, and she said, well, President Bush, then we have decided to give you this letter. And he took the letter, and he was about to put it in his pocket, but, you know, it was adorable. And so he said, would you like me to read this letter right now? And she said, well, that would be your decision, President Bush. And so he opened the letter, and he started reading quietly. And he looked up, and he said, we do not torture. And he looked down and kept reading and said, we do not torture. And she said, well, then, President Bush, would you unsign the signing statement you signed next to the McCain anti-torture bill, which meant that you don't have to abide by that law? And then a student, one of the presidential scholars from Montana, he chimed in and he said, President Bush, we can represent something better than torture to the rest of the world. And President Bush put the letter away. Well, Leah Librescu still had her letter up her sleeve, so she gave it to the press. And this was, it became somewhat of a story.